Part 1. Nationalism. 1815. Jefferson's Warning. The charred White House lay in ruins, burned the previous summer by an invading British army. A small, backward, economically prostrate United States emerged, shocked from its second war with the British enemy. The Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812, was not a real peace, but had only suspended by a truce the armed conflict, said former President Thomas Jefferson. Continued British aggression pointed to eternal war and the extermination of the one or the other party. Facing no protective tariffs, British ships dumped imports at below their cost of production, undercutting those few American manufacturers that had sprung up during the War of 1812. The Founders' Bank of the United States had been closed in 1811, so there was now no national currency, only monetary chaos and parasitical speculation. As in a feudal country, a few poor roads linked the coastal cities. The thinly populated new western states were accessible on horseback across the mountains. Midwesterners could get to the East Coast by somehow reaching the Ohio River, drifting through rapids to New Orleans, and taking an ocean voyage. Little isolated charcoal-stoked foundries huddled around rural woods and nearby iron ore supplies. They yielded less metal than 150 years earlier in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, before the British Empire had forbidden American manufacturers. Yet, the British Army's torching of Washington has helped rather than hurt us, Jefferson wrote, by arousing the general indignation of our country and by marking to the world the vandalism and brutal character of the English government. We had learned a bitter lesson and were forming a national plan of action. A quarter century before, Jefferson himself and his Virginia colleagues James Madison and James Monroe had relied on British imperial free trade dogmas in a political feud against George Washington and Alexander Hamilton's founding nationalist program. But now, the barely successful defensive war and experience of near-fatal weakness was uniting all sections to turn back to nationalism under the anti-British Jeffersonian Party. There is no American support for disunion, Jefferson wrote. The grounds of these exist only in English newspapers. Hamilton had exposed and destroyed Aaron Burr's Northeast secession plans, and he died at Burr's hand. 3 years later, Jefferson had Burr arrested for treason and prevented his private army from delivering the West to the British Empire. America now undertook a new mission: to survive and flourish by quickly transforming itself into a powerful modern nation. We would do this, as Jefferson put it, by arranging our financial system and, above all, pushing our domestic manufacturers. A new generation of nationalist leaders now took charge. A closely cooperating team of senior strategists in government, national banking, the military, and private enterprise rallied the population and guided the investment of American talent, labor, and credit over the next 2 decades. This program of invention and construction was widely popular. It continued with astounding results until aborted by Andrew Jackson. The British Empire, frantic to block the Republic's rise as a great power, drove Jackson from within and outside the regime until he turned the U.S. over to British puppets on Wall Street and in the slave South. Using primary sources, this video will identify these American nationalists and tell how, in one coordinated initiative, they set up the canals, railroads, iron industry, coal mining, and machine capabilities that changed America's geography, created its productive labor force, and shifted the country out of backwardness. The report will demonstrate the British origin and treasonous character of the opposition to this transformation. Perhaps what will be most shocking to most Americans is that the essential basis for this astounding industrialization of the United States was national banking. In specific, the operation of the Second National Bank of the United States. In March 1815, James Monroe was exhausted. The previous September, following the burning of Washington, and just after the standoff at Fort McHenry, Monroe had assumed the office of Secretary of War, on top of his post as Secretary of State. Monroe had pulled the war effort together. For the last 6 months of the conflict, he was the rock on which national defense pivoted. Now, with the peace treaty ratified, Monroe laid out the War Department duties, tired, and perhaps still feeling the bullet that remained in his body from the Revolutionary War Battle of Trenton. Everyone expected Monroe to be elected in 1816 as successor to President James Madison. Monroe called for a fundamental strengthening of the U.S. military and an overall defense strategy based on federal guidance for economic development. A resolve for action was becoming irresistible behind Monroe's candidacy. A few notable public figures were just then giving energy to this growing consensus for arranging our finances and pushing our domestic manufacturers. President Madison had brought Philadelphia lawyer Alexander Dallas in as Treasury Secretary when the national finances collapsed in the war crisis. Secretary Dallas now called for creating a second Bank of the United States. Dallas and his friend Matthew Carey together had led Pennsylvania's Jeffersonian Party back to the nation-building principles of Washington and Hamilton. Carey had written The Olive Branch in the depths of the War of 1812, exposing treasonous financiers and urging the Jeffersonians to give up the British free trade doctrine. Jefferson and Madison thanked and congratulated Carey. The book was the greatest American bestseller in the early 19th century. Two Southern political partners, Kentucky's Henry Clay and South Carolina's John C. Calhoun, had led the militants who swept into Congress in 1810, demanding a stand against British armed aggression and for nationalist economics. This brought on the 1812 declaration of war and a countrywide determination for government measures to break out of backwardness and depression. John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts provided the sharpest global strategic thinking for the new nationalists, with a religious conviction of the necessity for industrial and scientific progress. The former President John Adams' son, he had broken early on with the Federalist Party on the explicit grounds that the Boston Federalists were treasonously conspiring with the British enemy. He had resigned his Senate seat and put himself at the disposal of President Jefferson. Madison made Adams ambassador to Britain and head of the team negotiating to end the War of 1812. In his annual message to Congress in December 1815, President Madison signaled what was coming and what was expected when Monroe would take his place in the presidency. It is essential to every modification of the finance that the benefits of a uniform national currency should be restored to the community, so the probable operation of a national bank will merit consideration. In adjusting the duties on imports, the influence of the tariff on manufacturers necessarily present itself for consideration, and for introducing and maturing manufacturing establishments, especially of the more complicated kinds, and keeping them not only safe against occasional competitions from abroad, but a source of domestic wealth and even of external commerce. Among the means of advancing the public interests, the occasion is a proper one for recalling the great importance of establishing throughout our country the roads and canals which can best be executed under the national authority. There was virtually no American opposition to the upcoming presidential candidacy of James Monroe, who had just organized America's victory in the war against Britain. Yet this political reality made all the more urgent to British geopolitics the goal of blocking and ultimately overturning the political movement of Monroe and his allies. Otherwise, a USA of greatly magnified capabilities would gain the power to end the empire's world dominance. In an 1815 letter to Lafayette, Jefferson wrote that those who would work to break our national unity, such as the New England Federalists who had schemed for secession with Aaron Burr in 1804 and tried to derail the war effort with their 1814-15 Harbor Convention. The British had paid for the ultra-radicals in the French Revolution, and Jefferson wrote, "The traitors of Massachusetts are in the same pay, under the same orders, and making the same efforts to anarchize us that their prototypes in France did there." Jefferson's warning was very precise in naming Lord Castlereagh, then Britain's Foreign Secretary, as the source for disunion initiatives. Jefferson, in his report, has the character of an oracle when we examine the enemy strategy that shaped Jackson's presidency and left the country at the mercy of those who would tear it to pieces. President Jefferson, 1801-09, and his Secretary of State and presidential successor, James Madison, 1809-17, used U.S. intelligence assets abroad to keep Aaron Burr under surveillance. When Burr traveled to Europe after fleeing the USA in 1808, the U.S. ambassador to England, William Pinckney, wrote to Madison in 1808 about the movements in London of Burr and his aide. And given Burr's extraordinary relationship to the course of military and strategic developments before and during the War of 1812-15, it is certain that the retired Jefferson, the sitting President Madison, and Madison's cabinet leader James Monroe were keeping close watch over Burr's activities after he returned to the United States in 1812. Let us now track Burr's motions, as Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe had done, until we arrive back at the situation in 1815, when Jefferson issued his confidential report to Lafayette. Following his 1807 treason trial, still under homicide charges in more than one location, Burr sailed for Britain by way of Nova Scotia, whose military governor was the British General Sir George Prevost, Aaron Burr's nephew by marriage. Sir George gave his uncle Aaron, traveling under the alias Mr. Edwards, a passport, as described in Burr's private diary. Government House, Halifax, June 20, 1808. You will allow the bearer, Mr. G. H. Edwards, to proceed without delay from Falmouth to London. The said G. H. Edwards, having dispatches for the Right Honourable Lord Castlereagh, at whose office he is immediately to present himself on his arrival in London. George Prevost. Burr arrived in London July 16, 1808, and met with Lord Castlereagh July 18 and 19. Then Secretary for War and the Colonies, Viscount Castlereagh, was directing the British spy system operating through Canada to spread disunion inside the USA. As the sitting U.S. Vice President in 1804, Burr had been the coordinator of that British influence network linking disloyal elements in New York and Boston. In May 1812, Burr, in disguise, returned to the U.S., landing in Boston. He immediately contacted Essex Junto member Jonathan Mason, a former U.S. Senator from Massachusetts and a lifetime friend. Burr then moved on to New York City, arriving June 7, 1812, just 11 days before the Congress declared war on the United Kingdom. As the Second U.S.-British War raged, Burr began assembling the New York-based enemy political apparatus that, 16 years later, would elect Andrew Jackson and guide him to the White House. Burr was so shamed and despised that no one outside the circles of his own former New York political machine would have anything publicly to do with him. But when Burr opened up a New York law practice, the 29-year-old lawyer Martin Van Buren joined him in several of his cases. Van Buren was Burr's protege, having started his legal career as a trainee in 1801 in the office of Burr's political lieutenant William Peter Van Ness, and as an initiate in Burr's Tammany Hall organization. Van Buren's boss, Van Ness, arranged Burr's fatal 1804 duel with Hamilton, served as Burr's second, and then was a fugitive from justice. Van Buren managed the case and got the homicide charges against Van Ness dropped. As the Burr-Van Buren partnership began in 1812, Van Buren was encouraged to run for political office for the first time. He was elected to the New York State Senate that year and co-authored various state legislation with Burr. Martin Van Buren suddenly emerged as the leader of a New York State political movement. Known initially as the Bucktails, Van Buren's groupings was organized around stopping the building of a great waterway connecting the Port of New York and the Hudson River with Lake Erie. Van Buren was the public face of the project to reactivate the state political machine that Burr had run from the 1890s through 1804. Working with Van Buren was Burr's aide, Samuel Stout, who had fled with Burr to Britain and arranged Burr's introduction to British intelligence strategist Jeremy Bentham, who continued to sponsor Burr under the intelligence system led by Lord Castlereagh. Stout came back to New York with Burr and would play an important behind-the-scenes role in pushing Andrew Jackson to the presidency. Jackson was considered particularly useful because he had become a war hero in the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, not in any way because of his political activities. We are now back at that point at the close of the war in 1815 when Jefferson wrote to Lafayette warning that the only serious internal disunion threat to our country would emanate from the likes of Lord Castlereagh. Later that year, Burr wrote a confidential letter to his son-in-law, Joseph Alston, the former governor of South Carolina. Burr put forward for the first time the proposal that military hero Jackson be used as a tool in the destruction of American nationalism, and specifically to try to prevent the imminent presidential election of nationalist James Monroe, who had organized military victories over Britain in the War of 1812. Burr wrote, "A congressional caucus will, in the course of the ensuing month, nominate James Monroe for President of the United States, and will call on all good Republicans to support the nomination. His nomination is equally exceptional and odious. A certain Gento of Virginians, having had possession of the government for 24 years, i.e., Washington, Jefferson, Madison, consider the United States as their property, and by bawling support the administration, have so long succeeded in duping the Republican public. One of their principal arts, and which has been systematically taught by Jefferson, is that of promoting schisms in the Republican Party. Let not the disgraceful domination continue. Monroe himself is improper and incompetent, naturally dull and stupid, extremely illiterate, indecisive, hypocritical, has no opinion on any subject. He served in the Revolutionary War. Monroe's whole duty was to fill his general's tankard. The moment is extremely auspicious for breaking down this degrading system. The best citizens of our country acknowledge the feebleness of our administration. If, then, there be a man in the United States of firmness and decision, and having standing enough to afford even a hope of success, it is your duty to hold him up to public view. That man is Andrew Jackson. Nothing is wanting but a respectable nomination, made before the proclamation of the Virginia caucus, and Jackson's success is inevitable. Burr's peculiar strategy was to target powerful Virginians, to begin pulling them away from allegiance to Jefferson and to alliance with Jefferson's enemy, John Randolph of Roanoke. Considering that the general public viewed Burr as a satanic figure, Burr cautioned that his own initiating role in this Jackson project should be kept secret. If this project should accord with your views, I could wish to see you prominent in the execution of it. It must be known to be your work. Monroe was nevertheless nominated in Virginia and elsewhere, and was elected president in November 1816. The public supported the incoming Monroe presidency with a unanimity seen only once before with General Washington's first term. Burr and Van Buren bided their time. Burr's man, Samuel Soward, meanwhile, became a political advisor to General Andrew Jackson. Part 2. Planning the Breakout. The new president ordered a board of engineers for fortifications organized on November 16, 1816, and commissioned French engineer and intelligence professional Simon Bernard to run it. For the next 12 years, the president would use the Bernard Board to plan engineering works of national importance. And in January 1817, the Second Bank of the United States opened for business in Philadelphia. Monroe called John Quincy Adams back from Britain to serve as his Secretary of State. As U.S. Ambassador in London, Adams had just negotiated personally with Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh for a commercial treaty, and had met repeatedly with intelligence specialist Jeremy Bentham, thereby taking the measure of these two evil personalities, the empire's two main operators of Western Hemisphere intrigue. Monroe appointed Virginia lawyer William Wirt as Attorney General. President Jefferson had made his friend Wirt the prosecutor in Auburn. Aaron Burr's 1807 treason trial. Thus, Wirt came to share fully in the classified U.S. knowledge of the British underground in America, notably including the two Quids, anti-Jeffersonian factions. Burr witness Andrew Jackson and John Randolph of Roanoke, the foreman of the Burr grand jury. The phrase era of good feelings came to be identified with the Monroe administration during the president's 1817 National Unity Tour of the country. All sections backed the plan for an explosion of economic progress. We begin a survey of the states with New York. On March 18, 1817, 2 weeks after Monroe's inauguration, a bill to fund state construction of the Erie Canal was introduced in the legislation. Popular enthusiasm for former New York Mayor DeWitt Clinton's initiative forced Attorney General Martin Van Buren to cave in and publicly support the project, though his Bucktail faction continued political sabotage efforts. In tandem with the 1817 canal startup, West Point Superintendent General Joseph G. Swift arranged with entrepreneur-engineer Governor Kimball to erect the West Point Foundry across the river from the military academy. The foundry would produce artillery, fittings for Erie Canal locks, piping for the New York City water system, and soon, America's first locomotives. Moves for industrial development and infrastructure were also on the boards in the southern states to complement federal initiatives. South Carolina's legislature elected Andrew Pickers, a close relative of John C. Calhoun, as governor in December 1816. Governor Pickens sponsored a program of internal improvements using public funds, championing the construction of roads and canals. The Georgia legislature elected William Raboon governor in 1817. He pushed for internal improvements for the navigation of the state's rivers and for support of free public schools. North Carolina's Board of Internal Improvements spent $220,000 of state funds from 1817 to 1821. Virginia established its Fund for Internal Improvement in 1816 for rendering navigable and uniting by canals the principal rivers, and of more intimately connecting by public highways the different parts of the Commonwealth, and to create a Board of Public Works and a principal engineer to supervise projects and administer their public and private funding. Tennessee elected William Carroll as governor in 1821. He had been the hero general of Tennessee's militia in the Battle of New Orleans, alongside his friend Andrew Jackson. Voters repeatedly swept Carroll into office for his program of building roads and bridges and his American system nationalist economics. When Tennessee's Andrew Jackson later made war on the Bank of the United States, the people of Tennessee elected and re-elected Governor Carroll, a supporter of the bank and backer of nationalist leader Henry Clay. Settlers poured into the wilderness of Ohio after the War of 1812, anticipating the construction of a cheap water transport route between that new state and the Atlantic coast. Ohio elected Ethan Allen Brown governor by a landslide in 1818. Brown had been trained in the law as Alexander Hamilton's clerk and student in New York in 1801. Governor Brown created Ohio's Canal Commission and formed a tight partnership with DeWitt Clinton to promote and engineer the New York and Ohio canal systems as a unified national enterprise. Yet, despite public eagerness for results, the country's progress was stalled. The reopened Bank of the United States, under incompetent initial leadership, failed to steer investment into productive channels. Monroe had the bank's first president fired in 1819, but his replacement, Langdon Cheves, tightened credit and worsened an ongoing depression. President Monroe appointed his own protege, Nicholas Biddle, a director of the bank, as part of its 1819 leadership reshuffle. A national political economy strategy team now began operating at an increased tempo. Our focus here shall be on several cooperating individuals: Nicholas Biddle, DeWitt Clinton, John Quincy Adams, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, Matthew Carey, and Alexander DeBach. This was a community of men of genius. They shared an excitement over the immediate potential for a rapid advancement of mankind and a sober assessment of the European oligarchy's power and intention to disrupt their efforts. Biddle, aged 33 in 1819, was anxious to prove himself worthy of his family's patriotic heritage and his own intellectual gifts. He had been a clerk for Monroe during Monroe's ambassadorship in Britain and had edited the journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition. He was a scholar who had served in the Pennsylvania legislature, run a farm, and shown a general interest in public affairs, including the role of banking to serve the economy. Monroe brought Biddle in to guide the bank because Biddle would use banking as the most natural way of protecting the poorer classes of society from the usury of a moneyed aristocracy. When Biddle became president of the Bank of the United States, he displaced the representatives of the British imports banking company Brown Brothers from their powerful positions on the bank's board. The firm, based in Liverpool and Baltimore, had made great profits trading with the British during the War of 1812, and had set up branches in Philadelphia, New York, and London after the war. Brown Brothers came to control a large percentage of all Anglo-American trade, and a majority of the trade in cotton exported through Wall Street to England for the decades preceding the Civil War. In the political showdown with Andrew Jackson during the early 1830s, Brown Brothers had become the most important U.S.-based financial entity in the camp of the enemies of Nicholas Biddle. In that Depression year of 1819, the national team started up a project to bring in coal to replace wood, which was then still universally used for fuel and metal processing. There was as yet virtually no American commercial coal mining industry. Biddle, Carey, and Philadelphia friends began explaining to shop owners and investors that hard coal could burn cleanly and efficiently, though it needed a high ignition temperature. General Joseph G. Swift, his West Point foundry now in production, came to Philadelphia representing New York Governor DeWitt Clinton and on a commission from the New Jersey legislature. Swift proposed an interstate scheme for the Biddle-Carey project. Construct a canal to carry coal from eastern Pennsylvania through New Jersey to the Hudson River and New York City. Known as the Morris Canal, it was to be a breathtaking success in national development, sponsored by New York, New Jersey, and the Bank of the United States. What was on Clinton's mind may be seen in a message he had written to the New York legislature back in 1794. The hand of art will change the face of the universe. Mountains, deserts, and oceans will feel its mighty force. It will not then be debated whether hills shall be prostrated, but whether the Alps and the Andes shall be leveled. Not whether sterile fields shall be fertilized, but whether the deserts of Africa shall feel the power of cultivation, not whether rivers shall be joined, but whether the Caspian shall see the Mediterranean, and the waves of the Pacific lave the Atlantic. Secretary of War Calhoun was eager to use military engineers for great civil works. Having introduced into Congress the 1816 bill to recharter the Bank of the United States, Calhoun commended investing the bank's profits for transportation projects directed by the federal government. That the bank would somehow help direct such great projects became certain when President Monroe and the bank's directors made Nicholas Biddle the bank's president on January 7, 1823. Part 3. Liftoff. An overwhelming public majority supporting them, the Nationalists now proceeded with a program that would create modern times in America. House Speaker Henry Clay led the Congress in 1824 in passing a serious protective tariff and the General Survey Act, authorizing the President to assign Army engineers to civil works of national importance. The Philadelphia Circle of Nicholas Biddle and Matthew Carey founded the Franklin Institute for Scientific Research in aid of rapid industrialization and set up a companion group, the Society for the Promotion of International Improvements. At the same time, in 1824, Clinton and his supporters founded the Albany Institute for the same ends, making the outstanding scientist Joseph Henry its curator. Under Biddle's guidance, the Society for Internal Improvements sent architect and civil engineer William Strickland to carry out industrial espionage in the British Isles. Strickland had designed the classically beautiful Philadelphia headquarters building for the Bank of the United States, modeled on the Parthenon of Athens. With the help of American sympathizers in Ireland, England, and Wales, Strickland accomplished his foreign mission brilliantly, getting designs of British transport and industrial properties and devices, despite the Empire's hostility against such leaks. The compilation of Strickland's reports on canals, railways, roads, and other subjects, made to the Pennsylvania Society for the Promotion of Industrial Improvement, was published in 1826 by Matthew Carey's son, Henry C. Carey, and Henry's partner, Isaac Lee. This volume provides us an overview of the problems that American engineering sought to overcome in changing the face of the continent and the nature of the economy, with illustrated chapters on canal construction, tunneling, iron forges, the use of coal, and experiments with steam locomotives. In the 1825 presidential election, in which none of the candidates, John Q. Adams, Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, and William Crawford, received a majority of the electoral votes, and the choice was thrown into the House of Representatives for a decision in accordance with the Constitution. It is most notable that the Van Buren machine did not back Andrew Jackson in 1824. Jackson had no known principles and was publicly unidentified except as a military hero. There was some speculation that he might be put at the disposal of nationalists. Van Buren promoted Treasury Secretary William Crawford, a free trader from Georgia who had little influence in the Monroe administration, and who did poorly in the presidential election. Jackson received 39% of the electoral votes. There were very few popular votes counted, to Adams' 32% and Clay's 14%. Thus, Adams and Clay combined total of 46% exceeded Jackson's, and the only known anti-nationalist, Crawford got only 16%. Nationalist John C. Calhoun was unanimously elected vice president. The U.S. Congress chose Adams as president. Adams then appointed Henry Clay Secretary of State. At this juncture, Samuel Stewart, Burr's arranger in London, advised Jackson he had been robbed. The cry of a corrupt bargain rang out as a declaration of war, and the anti-nationalist political wheels began spinning around Jackson. John Quincy Adams' March 4, 1825 inauguration was the start of one of the most intense periods of economic progress in history. Canals and roads were pushed through, opening up the West to settlement, funneling new mined coal to shops and cities, and creating entirely new Midwestern centers of industry. The iron industry, under tariff protection, was reborn after a century of imperial suppression. Railroads began military-designed construction and grew quickly from nothing to thousands of miles. Financing and planning of these enterprises was coordinated by federal, military, state, and local authorities. The Bank of the United States drove the program forward with credit regulation that throttled down parasitical speculation and directed public and private investment funds into infrastructure and industry. Researchers affiliated with the bank military government leadership team did pioneering work with engines and electricity that led to spectacular advances later on. We will highlight here some of the strategic successes of this era. 1. Canals. In July 1825, New York's Erie Canal was nearing completion. Governor DeWitt Clinton was in Ohio, joining that state's leaders in breaking ground for the two great canal projects that would complete the first water route from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River system. The Ohio and Erie Canal cuts south from Lake Erie through the eastern section of the state to the Ohio River, giving birth to the cities of Cleveland and Columbus. The Miami Canal connected the Ohio River at Cincinnati with the western end of Lake Erie, creating the city of Toledo. On the Ohio-Erie Canal, the toll was $12 for a 300-mile shipment of 1,000 pounds of flour, bread, wheat, seeds, soap, wool, carpentry goods, or plows, $6 for 1,000 pounds of fertilizer, $3 for 1,000 pounds of iron ore or coal, and $3 for 1,000 shingles. A passenger traveling 300 miles paid $1.50. The J.Q. Adams administration put through Congress an alignment of hundreds of thousands of acres of land for sale to aid Ohio in financing these canals. The engineering board under General Bernard surveyed routes for Ohio's Erie Canal. Other canal routes surveyed were the Dismal Swamp Canal, the Chesapeake and Ohio, Buzzards Bay, and Boston Harbor canals. At the 1828 dedication commencing federal construction of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal from Washington, D.C. to the Ohio River, President Adams turned the first spade of earth and reminded the celebrants, "The Lord of the universe said unto them, Be fruitful and plentiful, and replenish the earth, and subdue it. We perform his will in the subjugation of the earth for the improvement of the condition of man." The Morris Canal traversed the state of New Jersey from the Delaware River across the Pennsylvania coal mining country, up through Newark to New Jersey on the Hudson River, across from Manhattan. Cheap coal streamed into the shops of the New Jersey industrial urban corridor that was built up from the canal banks. The cheap fuel poured into New York City, whose real wealth came from a giant manufacturing hub. Iron ore from northern New Jersey was delivered in return to Pennsylvania's booming iron foundries. 2. Coal. The state of Pennsylvania, lobbied by Nicholas Biddle and Matthew Carey, invested millions of dollars beginning in 1825 for a system of canals connecting the coal mining regions with the cities and the Atlantic ports. Canals were also built linking western Pennsylvania, notably Pittsburgh, to the new agro-industrial powerhouse in Ohio. In later years, the Bank of the United States sponsored the creation of the Reading Railroad. The bank owned a fourth of the railroad stock, especially for the purpose of transporting coal to market. The American coal mining industry began as a direct result of these projects. A talented young German economist named Frederick List, who had been imprisoned under the British Habsburg domination of Europe, emigrated to Pennsylvania. List helped develop the coal mines there as entrepreneur and inventor. He studied and worked closely with Carey and Biddle on tariff and financial strategy. Returning to Europe in 1830, List created Germany's first railroad and succeeded in joining the German states into a tariff union, the first step to nationhood. List's published work on the American system of economics and that of Henry C. Carey would inspire nationalists in Ireland, Germany, Russia, Japan, India, and Mexico to rebel against British imperial free trade doctrines that otherwise condemned them to eternal backwardness. 3. Railroads. Under the authority of the 1824 General Survey Act, President Adams assigned Army engineers to work with new, privately owned railway companies. Military men surveyed and designed the routes for the nation's first 60 or so railroads. The West Point Foundry turned out the first American locomotives. The Best Friend of Charleston and the West Point were built for the South Carolina Railroad and Canal Company, chartered in 1827, and the DeWitt Clinton for the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad, chartered in 1826. Adams ordered a dozen or more Army engineers to plan and supervise construction of the first commercial railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, to link the Atlantic port of Baltimore with the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. The B&W builders used Army administrative and accounting procedures disseminated in railway publications and adopted by other companies made American railroads punctual and uniquely effective. Baltimore's community leaders financed the B&W by selling $3 million in company bonds to private investors and $1.5 million worth to the city of Baltimore. The state of Maryland later granted the railroad $500,000. Maryland and Baltimore bought $6 million in B&W bonds. The line reached Wheeling, now in West Virginia, thanks to a $500,000 subscription from the city of Wheeling. State and local governments provided more than half of the overall capital invested in early American railways. Most private capital came from small investors, merchants, local manufacturers, farmers, and tradesmen on the route of a proposed railroad. The New York stock market played no role until New York financiers later bought up lines and treated them as speculative instruments with unwholesome results. General Swift's son-in-law, George Washington Whistler, was a talented West Point graduate and Army engineer on the B&W and many other projects. In the 1840s, Swift and Whistler arranged to send Whistler to Russia. He built that country's first railroad from Moscow to St. Petersburg, cementing the alliance between Russia and America. Benjamin Franklin and his junto had nurtured foundries in colonial Pennsylvania, The 1750 British Iron Act prohibited foundries, and they were discouraged by early 1800s U.S. free trade policy, by British dumping following the War of 1812, and by the 1819 tight money depression. With government encouragement and tariff protections from 1824 and 1828 legislation, national iron production rose from 20,000 tons in 1820 to 200,000 tons by 1832. At that time, 200 bushels of charcoal costing $10 could produce 1 ton of raw iron, pig iron. 2 tons of anthracite coal costing only $5 could potentially produce the same ton of iron. The Franklin Institute offered gold medals to the manufacture of the greatest amount of iron made with anthracite, and silver medals for research into anthracite steam generation, and to inventors of anthracite-using boilers. The Institute's research leader was Alexander Dallas Bach, Franklin's great-grandson, and the grandson of Madison's Treasury Secretary, Alexander Dallas, who had revived the Bank of the United States in 1816. Graduating from West Point in 1825 as an Army engineer, Bach began research at the Franklin Institute around 1828. Early on, he specialized in steam boiler development, and his collaboration in the development of electricity and geomagnetism would have profound global results. A $5,000 prize for anthracite iron was offered personally by Nicholas Biddle and Henry Carey's publishing partner, Isaac Lee. The Biddle Prize was awarded in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, to pioneer furnace, put in blast in 1839 using pure anthracite and iron ore. In January 1840, Biddle and Lee awarded the prize, and Biddle spoke to the banquet celebration of America's industrial victory. The bank, gyroscope of economic progress. The credit of the United States was good, internally and abroad, because the country loaned and invested its credit into physically productive enterprises that created far more future real wealth than was expected to build them. Everyone prized the debt, bonds, and notes currency that the nation emitted for this purpose, because the system of self-government based on the progress and investment of the population was obviously the most stable possible. The American founders designed the Bank of the United States to manage that credit system. No monetary system is legal under the Constitution, and no civilization can durably survive governed by a financier oligarchy hostile to the improvement of man's condition. Congress, in 1816, had chartered the Second Bank of the United States for 20 years with 35 million capital, 7 million supplied by the government. With $35 million capital, $7 million supplied by the government. This was a substantial sum compared, for example, to total money then in circulation, about $75 million, or the annual federal revenue, about $25 million, mostly from customs duties. The U.S. president appointed 5 directors, while stockholders chose the other 15. The president nominated the bank's president, with the directors' formal acceptance. The bank was an object of intense public attention, was legally subject to congressional scrutiny, and could have its charter revoked if it violated the public trust. Any foreign holder of the bank's stock was explicitly barred from voting his shares. Biddle managed the Bank of the United States so as to elevate the power and living standards of the United States. During that period of amazing transformation, economic growth was uninterrupted, and there was a stable national currency. The bank invested directly in canals, railroads, roads, and coal and iron enterprises, and loaned money to states and cities engaged in such projects. An investigation of the bank carried out in 1841 by financiers stockholders hostile to Biddle has left on the public record faint traces of the bank's direct investments under his management. Some of the bank's loans and stock and bond holdings mentioned are given in Part 1. Of more importance to national progress than its direct investments, the bank managed credit so that investments from within the United States and from overseas constantly flowed into needed and productive activities. Biddle managed bank intervention in markets to stabilize prices of commodities and securities, to weather financial disturbances, and protect farmers, manufacturers, and infrastructure under construction. All of this would have been to no effect had the Bank of the United States not kept speculators from destroying the economy. By its charter, the bank received and protected the deposits of the U.S. government's funds, primarily custom duties. An importing merchant would pay the amount due at the New York or other customs depot. Customs officials would immediately deposit this payment in the New York or other branch of the Bank of the United States. Often, the merchant would pay with circulating notes from some private or state bank, which were allegedly redeemable in gold or silver by the issuing bank. Biddle and his staff, vigilant against unsafe speculative emissions or outright fraud, might take notes quickly back to the issuing bank and demand the promised hard money payment. Note and credit issuers were thus held to reasonable banking practices, protecting the government and the entire community. Biddle was the chief public official managing national economic development in conjunction with the President and the Congress. The critical observer will notice the striking differences between the purpose of that banking function and that of today's Federal Reserve Bank, which drains all wealth into the global speculative whirlpool. The successful nationalist policy of 1815 to the 1830s propelled the economy into new powers over nature and new realms of technology and skill. But for the United States to continue in this direction was incompatible with the survival of the British Empire. There was an explosion. Part 4. London breaks the bank. Understandably, Martin Van Buren burned all of his private papers. People called him the Little Magician, or the Fox, because, like his partner, Aaron Burr, he declined to reveal his views on the issues. Kingpin of the Albany Regency, personally supported by his own banking speculations, Senator Van Buren was becoming New York State's unchallenged political boss. He and his lieutenants aimed at dictating selection of virtually all public officers. In 1827, a year before the presidential election, the Burr-Van Buren forces were ready to strike. Van Buren told his Virginia political partner, Thomas Ritchie, that opposition to slavery could be crushed by a Jackson presidency under the proper management. He specified that Jackson had no political party or principles and would be guided by the New York-Virginia political combination. Van Buren wrote, "It was not until party attachment had been broken down that the clamor against Southern influence and African slavery could be made effectual in the North. Those in the South who assisted in producing the change are, I am satisfied, now deeply sensible of their error. Every honest Federalist of the South therefore should, and would if he duly reflected upon the subject, prefer the revival of old party feelings to any other state of things he has a right to expect. Then the South was divided, now it is united. Lastly, the effect of such a nomination on General Jackson could not fail to be considerable. His election, as the result of his military services without reference to party, and so far as he alone is concerned scarcely to principle, would be one thing. His election as the result of a combined and concerted effort of a political party, holding in the main to certain tenets and opposed to certain prevailing principles, might be another and a far different thing. He called for a great political combination between the planters of the South and the plain Republicans of the North. A new party was hatched, to be called Democratic, appealing to pro-slavery states' rights men in the South. To protectionists and nationalists in other sections, Jackson defeated Adams in the presidential elections of 1828. Van Buren was at the same time elected governor of New York, but was immediately appointed U.S. Secretary of State. Jackson later made him ambassador to England and then vice president. Van Buren would run the anti-national policy change, the attack against the Bank of the United States, and the vetoing of internal improvements. Who wanted the bank killed? Just after the election of Andrew Jackson, Adams, Secretary of the Treasury, wrote to Biddle, "You have probably as much or more to fear for the bank from New York as from Virginia. The frog of Wall Street puffs himself into the ox of Lombard Street and will not have you abuse him." In 1831, as the administration's public assaults against Biddle increased, the Brown Brothers Bank sold off its shares in the Bank of the United States and worked politically against Biddle with Prime Ward and King, the official New York banking agency of the British government. Protective tariffs were sharply reduced in 1832 to put a brake on industrial development. The tariff deal was arranged as a compromise with the madhouse secessionists of South Carolina. Georgia, inflamed by rumors of gold on Cherokee land, was induced to go along with the deal by another compromise. Jackson defied the Supreme Court, broke the treaty made by President George Washington, and expelled the Cherokees from their sovereign territory, killing thousands and disgracing America. By personal intrigues, emulating Shakespeare's Iago, Van Buren engineered a vicious personal split between Jackson and Calhoun. This ensured that Calhoun would be irrevocably stuck in the camp of the British allied Southern fanatics who were surrounding him in South Carolina. Calhoun's fall from nationalism cemented the Southern bargain with Wall Street. To honor John Randolph for his central role in the Jackson to the presidency project, Van Buren got the flamboyant Virginian monarchist appointed ambassador to Russia. Randolph fell on his knees in the presence of the Tsar. The takedown of the Bank of the United States was a lethal blow to American sovereignty. Jackson vetoed the recharter and stopped government deposits going into the bank long before its lawful charter had expired. Treasury Secretary Roger Taney put government revenues into private and state banks, many of which were going bankrupt and lost the government's money. To stem the resulting chaos, Jackson issued the Specie Circular, requiring the purchasers of government lands, such as poor Western settlers, to pay gold and silver only. Economic doom descended. Private capitalists
would not invest long-term in infrastructure projects unless they were backed by the government or the national bank. Biddle had so organized credit flows that when Jackson ended the bank's legal regulatory function, foreign as well as domestic investors kept their funds out of railroads and canals. To sharpen the disaster, the Bank of England in 1836 pulled its credit out of the United States. This British action hit the Western and Mississippi Valley regions the hardest. Jackson chose Van Buren his successor, and when the Little Magician entered the White House in 1837, the U.S. economy crashed to the ground. New Yorkers pleaded with failing bankers to return their deposits. Amidst the rubble, with distressed properties for the taking, August Belmont arrived on Wall Street and set up the U.S. agency representing the Rothschilds, anti-American intelligence agents, and bankers to the British royal family. Jackson had previously appointed the Rothschilds as the American government's European banking agency, but they could have only poor prospects for speculative gain within the U.S. as long as the nation's bank had yielded effective financial power. Now the country was owned by the money lords. The impact of Jackson's destruction of the Second Bank of the United States was spread out over years, but it was devastating. Not only did it usher in wild speculation in land and other undertakings, it withdrew a stable means of credit for long-term investments in the kind of breakthrough industries and infrastructure which the nation needed in order to grow. Under these circumstances, the United States went from having a positive balance with Great Britain to going increasingly into debt, including through stalling the growth of manufacturers in the United States. By removing the national institution, which was supporting nation-spanning projects in transportation and the like, the destruction of the bank contributed to the renewed conflict between the states and between the agricultural slave-holding South and the industrializing, trading North. With the South lacking the benefits of the industrial projects that had been on the drawing boards prior to Jackson's veto of the bank's recharter, the Southern states became increasingly easy prey to the British-backed separatists who sought to finish off the United States as a power altogether. American nationalists did not surrender to the emerging Wall Street slave power axis. The 22-year-old Abraham Lincoln ran for the Illinois state legislature in 1831, supporting the Bank of the United States, internal improvements, and protective tariffs. In 1840, Lincoln and other opponents of Jackson campaigned for William Henry Harrison for president, and the Depression-disgusted public elected him over Van Buren. But Harrison, who had intended to move immediately to restore the bank, died a rather mysterious death weeks after his inauguration. Vice President John Tyler, from the anti-national state of Virginia, succeeded to the presidency. That August, Kentucky Senator Henry Clay led Congress to charter a new Bank of the United States. Tyler vetoed it. Congressmen and others rioted outside the White House. The Clay-led Congress passed a powerfully protective tariff in 1832 as the last action of the old nationalist leadership of the 1820s, and some industrial progress did ensue. But without the power of a sovereign credit system through a national bank, progress could not be sustained. It would take the election of Lincoln in the crisis of national survival called the Civil War to find the political circumstances to retake national control over the U.S. currency with the greenback system and win the war. Lincoln and his allies brought back American industrial and technological progress and exported it as the program of all mankind against the backwardness imposed by European imperialism. But, following the 1812 election of Woodrow Wilson, we have become increasingly under control of the European financial empire once again. Now, a half-century later, facing extinction from world war and economic collapse, we may yet find the courage to pick up again those powers which we have surrendered to our ancestral enemies in London and Wall Street. If survival is more tempting than the warm comfort of getting along, we will listen to Jefferson's warning not to be herded by the transatlantic empire and its hired pretenders. We will arrange our financial system and again reach for the stars.